All right, everybody, welcome back to oh, wait, messing around with my mic too much. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Like, is the audio good?
I can hear you fine, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so welcome, everybody, back to another episode. You know what? This is not good. Just because, like, I'm holding the mic in my lap and it's going to make a lot of annoying noises, so I should man up and just put the mic on the table. So... Third take. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode. Back with Dave Maconi once again. And today we are attempting to have a more technical discussion about something that has been a hot topic in the industry. Lots of interesting debates, lots of kind of flaming wars about this. And this is something that Dave and I have discussed privately quite a lot. So you will see what that topic is in a second. But Dave, first of all, welcome back. How are you doing?
Good. I feel like I always say I'm tired when we start. Yeah. I don't know why. I watched Godzilla versus Kong last night because there's not a lot to do. Dude, it's funny. Like sometimes I want to talk about stuff like MMA or even like a movie review or something, which obviously has nothing to do with my channel. Like MMA, I guess you could kind of branch off into that. Movie review, obviously not. But I'm curious, like, how many people out there are watching similar things as I am. But yeah, it wasn't a great movie.
Was or wasn't?
It was not. And I'm not like a stickler for movies. Like I'm all about like Marvel movies and just like entertainment for that brief period of time. But it was like, it was just, I said somebody must have been on shrooms when they were making this movie. Like it was just one completely ridiculous thing after another. I think it was probably 10 different times where I was like, what is happening right now?
Yeah, I'm not a big movie person in general, and I don't know what it is. It's just, I feel like sitting down for a 2-hour-long movie, it feels like a commitment almost. It's like, man, what if I don't like it? And I realize that like 1 hour in, it's like, fuck, I just wasted an hour of my life.
Yeah.
And then I'm probably, especially I hate watching movies together with someone, because then I cannot just stand up and leave after an hour,
right?
Or cannot just turn it off. So then it's like I'm forced to sit it through. Just one thing that your Godzilla thing reminded me of is, are you familiar with the completely ridiculous movie series called Sharknado?
Only as a joke. Like I hear people reference it jokingly, but I'm not completely familiar with it.
I mean, it is a joke. Like basically, it's for anybody who doesn't know. I mean, just look up the trailers. It will be pretty obvious what it's about. It's this new special tornado that comes that spits out sharks, and I think it ended up having like 5 parts to it, so like 5 different movies. And like the first one was very ridiculous to begin with, and it was obvious that it was one of those where the movie makers were just almost like I could totally see them sitting in the boardroom or whatever and just discussing like how things should be, and it's like just kind of teasing each other, almost like provoking each other, like, okay, how could we make it even more ridiculous? and as the newer and newer movies came up, like they just came up with even more ridiculous ideas. And like I think it was the 3rd or the 4th one, which I actually watched the whole thing, and man, it was like it was hilarious on its own way. It's like there's different types of humor. Like my favorite type of humor is kind of like the Friends, like the series Friends. Like that type of humor is the one that I like the most. But there is that type of like, okay, it's not really true comedy. It's just like, my goodness, it's so ridiculous that you cannot not laugh at it. And it's that type of thing. So
I have the trailer pulled up now, and wow, this is a real movie. That's fascinating.
No, man, just watch the trailers or watch some scenes from it, and it's or maybe some like movie reviews. There are these YouTube channels which are like reviewing like they seem like it's an honest, like serious critique of the movie, like analyzing it. Like some of those breaking down the movie, it's fucking hilarious. Just watching those is worth it. So probably you don't want to waste 2 hours of your life watching those movies, but
well, and not to get like so far off the fitness thing, I'm sure you'll have timestamps though, so people can skip it if they want. But you know, people tend to see like an A-level actor like a Chris Hemsworth or Chris Evans or something like that, and like, man, like I would want to do that. And it's like, dude, like 99% of these people, at least like coming up, had to do like nonsense, either like a bunch of training, but a lot of these like nonsense flicks. Like imagine being an actor and you're like, oh, here's your breakout, and then you're actually just starring in Sharknado, and like you have to try to take this absurd role seriously. It's like 99% of them, it's just gonna suck.
Yeah. Anyway, but there is a bunch of these. Like there is, what was it, robot crocodile or something. Birdemic, by the way. Just watch some. If you type into YouTube like Birdemic, so like bird emic, best scene ever or something like that. That's all you need to see. Just seeing that one scene is quite an experience, and that gives you an idea of how the whole movie is like. It's yeah, I'm glad that some people have an odd sense of humor. It's kind of like the type of jokes that like you make in high school with like just trolling around with your friends, like what kind of ridiculous stuff you can come up with. And I respect someone who actually invests some serious budget into a movie, hires actors, and makes this happen. Like I have some weird respect for these people. Anywho, so to our topic. So we are going to be talking basically all about failure training, reps in reserve, and basically that's going to be the main topic. So I basically made like 10 points for myself. So I made some notes for this that I want to cover here. And then I honestly have no idea if we are going to cover all of this in 25 minutes or 45 or maybe pushing 60. But I just want this to be informative and just all the thoughts that both of us have, just hash it out here. So, Dave, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So maybe let's start out with what failure is, like what training to failure actually means technically in a vacuum. So as we will discuss, it gets pretty murky pretty fast. But maybe let's just start out with what failure actually means, because honestly, I'm just seeing people posting all kinds of training videos and whatever, just descriptions of what they did. Like, okay, I did this to failure. Like, this was my last set. This was to failure. And then I look at it and I just have to roll my eyes because I'm like, no, that was not failure. Like, do you actually know what failure means? So let's just start out with the basics. So in a vacuum, like all things being equal, which they are not, but let's say they are, failure is when you actually fail a rep. All right. So you do a bench press. Let's say you use your 8 RM. It's 100 kilos. You can complete 8 repetitions. You do the 8 reps, then you attempt the 9th one and you fail that. You just train to failure. If you complete 8 reps and the last one was a serious grinder, like you really exerted yourself, like it was all out, like the concentric phase started or lasted for 5 seconds or 10 or whatever. You trained really hard. Nobody's accusing you of being a wuss, but that was not to failure. That's just technicality. So let's maybe start there. First of all, any comments on that so far?
Yeah, I mean, you'd think it's like it's a simple thing, right? Like most people who say that they're training to failure, they're not actually failing. But you could also even argue that some of the people who are failing are not training as hard as what is meant by training to failure, right? Like, yeah, they literally failed, but like I think of my cousin when he came and visited, and so, you know, I mentioned how he deadlifted 315 like the first time deadlifting, and it was like super easy for him, and then we put 365 on and he was just like, oh, I can't do it, and he put some effort in, but then he's just like, oh, I can't do it. So if somebody is like that and they're kind of new and they go, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they go for the 5th and they're like, oh no, I can't. Well, you and I both know if our brains were in that body, maybe we could have done another 2, 3, or 4 reps that this person didn't do. So when we say train to failure, we mean they have pushed so hard you could not possibly do another rep, and yet people who are quote unquote failing aren't pushing that hard. So it kind of changes like, well, what are we trying to get out of when we state training to failure?
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. That's such an obvious one that I didn't even think of noting down, but that's very true. And that's one of the kind of most fundamental things that is just kind of good to clarify, that failure is going to mean different things based on your training experience and, you know, maybe even things like work ethic. But just assuming that you're actually someone who has experience with this, you're a motivated, reasonably hardworking person in the gym, then true failure is when you're actually failing the rep. You're just not able to do. But definitely, I mean, I've taken friends of mine through sessions in the gym, just ask me like, hey, can you come down with me? Just help me out. I'm kind of new to this whole thing. And then they're doing some dumbbell lateral raises, and I can definitely tell that they had 3-4 more reps in them. It's just their delts started to burn really badly, so they just aborted the set right there. Now, so like I said, this is all in a vacuum. So all things being equal, that's what failure is. Now, this gets murky pretty fast, and this is actually something that you pointed out to me. I was aware of this, but I think I got a little bit like too pissy with the whole thing, just because I got so annoyed with people using the term just too haphazardly and not really using words according to what they actually mean. But then you pointed out that, like, look, training to failure, training one rep from failure, or even training beyond failure, like all of those things can start getting like kind of fuzzy, and it all starts blending together, and it really becomes a subjective thing. So do you want to touch on that?
Sure. I mean, a lot of times when people say training to failure, they mean that they're training to the point that they couldn't complete another rep. And I think colloquially that's a fine way to use it. I mean, technically, no, you didn't fail, but like I get it. Like that's as hard as most of us would recommend training. And that's actually where I think like the RIR kind of thing comes into play. Or even like an RPE, like if you said it's a 10, like I would always say, like back when I was like 14 writing this stuff down, I would say like a 9.5 was like, oh my God, like I just could not do another one. And a 10 for me was actually failing a rep. But you could say a zero RIR, and that I think gets the point across just fine. But if somebody says, oh, I trained to failure and it's just super hard, like I'm not gonna like get on their case about it. However, as far as like kind of like muddying the waters a little bit, you have a lot of factors that play into it. So for example, let's say that I could get 10, and if you look at like my Instagram, there's a video of me doing curls, and on the 12th rep, so I only show like the last two in this video, but on the 12th rep, I lean back and actually paused very briefly, and I leaned back. So if I kept form exactly constant, then I would not have gotten the rep, and I would have trained to failure. So are you saying then that when we're saying, oh, okay, I want you to train to failure, well, if I kept form the same and I didn't complete it and less work was actually done, then I would have trained to failure. But because I arched just a little bit, just enough to get it, now that's not training to failure. Well, I worked even harder, because I actually, and we can get into a whole thing about how loose form actually makes things harder, but we won't break off on that tangent. But anyway, it's you can manipulate form a little, especially like back exercises. I mean, you can go to failure with perfect form rows and then just add a little momentum and get another 5 or 6 reps. I mean, easily, like on a barbell row or something like that. So that I think complicates it a little bit, because these little things you can do can push you almost, in a way, you can almost argue that's beyond failure training, right? You lessen the stimulus just a little bit in that really hard part of the range of motion so that you can continue.
Yes. So one thing I just quickly noted down as you spoke there is just kind of a random thought for everybody that I think is important to keep in mind is, so the row, like a cable row is a perfect example of that, where because the sticking point is right at the end of the movement, like you can kind of always attempt a new rep, but you just won't be able to completely finish that movement, or that the concentric you won't be able to finish with perfect form. So then you can extend the set a little bit by using a bit of momentum. I think like a good rule of thumb, or like in general, like I think when you're modifying the form to get extra reps, I think the most important thing that I always tell my clients is it's fine to do that, but make that a standard thing. So for example, like lots of examples, on a curl, if you can only get that last rep by leaning back a little bit more and then doing a little bit of a cheat curl motion, then that's fine, but then always do that on the last rep. So you know that, okay, the last rep is going to be a bit cheaty, but then always make it the last rep. Or always make it the last 2 reps. Just don't start messing with the set where, okay, like week 1, it was the last rep only that was a bit cheaty. Week 2, it was the last 2. Then, you know, eventually you're like, yeah, you added like 5 more reps, or you added a bunch of load, but you're just making more and more of your reps more and more cheaty. So just make it standard. So that's just kind of a general rule to abide by. So that's kind of more so just a random thought that I wanted to throw in there. And then the other thing is it kind of ties into the whole concept of like technical failure, which a lot of people like to use. So it's like, okay, don't train to failure, train to technical failure. So when form starts breaking down, I think that on certain movements, that becomes a little bit murky, a little bit hard to exactly get it right when that point comes. On a lot of movements, so this is where it becomes like very exercise specific. On a lot of movements, basically training to failure or 1 rep from failure or training to technical failure, like all of these things basically become the same thing. Because if I think about a Romanian deadlift, for example, which this week I just tweaked my back on a little bit. Basically, the alteration in my execution on the last rep of that Romanian deadlift, which ended up hurting my back a little bit. If you look at like the millimeter difference in my posture, or just how much less rigid my lower back stayed, is basically identical to how much my elbows would move when I'm like giving a little bit more momentum to a cable curl, which is to say it was very, very minor. So on that cable curl, I just moved my elbow forward a little bit, and that helped me to get that last rep. On that Romanian deadlift, it was, if you looked at it from the outside, probably you wouldn't have even noticed the difference. But I could feel it internally, like it literally was just like a millimeter difference in my posture. But that was already enough to like almost get me severely hurt. So on a lot of movements, basically, you have to be like pretty strict about like when you are stopping the set. And so on a deadlift, basically, I would say there is almost no such thing as training to like true failure, because in practice that just means form breaking down and getting hurt.
I would agree that to like if you're talking technical failure, it's hard to get to failing on a squat without some of your mechanics changing. I certainly think you can obviously train to failure to the point that like you go down for another rep and you don't go back up, obviously. But if you're just saying like inherently in that process, your form is going to change, yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's actually hard to like really get to that point without like really exposing yourself to higher injury risk. So in practice, like very few people will actually do it, which is why I often don't quite buy it when in studies they say they squat it to failure. Because like, especially if you're a researcher, like you're not going to get your participants hurt. So you're probably gonna make them stop when you see that, okay, it's starting to look a little bit funky.
So I've only run a couple of studies, and in one of them, the participants were squatting, quote unquote, to failure. But they were pushing themselves fairly hard, but it's just different. I mean, if they're untrained. But I mean, that's also, like, I don't want to just crap on the studies too, because part of it is, like, you have to take that into account, right? So, like, a beginner trained to failure, we know is just not going to be at the same level of intensity as somebody who's been doing it for, like, 5 to 10 years, which is also probably part of why you do see more of a benefit to failure training in beginners, because they might be taking it only to the intensity that what an advanced trainee is maybe like a 2 RIR. They just feel like it's the failure, which is, and I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole, but I mean, it is interesting when you consider that like a lot of these guys will say, well, the more advanced you get, the harder you have to train, and you have to train, to and beyond failure. And yet all the studies really kind of show the opposite.
Yeah, I think maybe we should just briefly address the whole difference between saying 1 rep from failure versus saying 1 RIR versus saying a 9 RPE. So I'm just quickly going to say, usually I like to use the terminology reps from failure because it's very straightforward. So to me, and I think not just to me, but objectively, that's what it should mean. When I say 1 rep from failure, that means getting all the reps in a set that you can. So basically you're doing an M rep. So if it's your 8 rep max on a bench, you're doing 8 reps. That would be 1 rep from failure. That is not the same thing as 1 RIR. So 1 RIR means that you could complete 1 more rep. So 1 RIR is actually 2 reps from failure. And then RPE is even murkier. So I just actually pulled it up before we started talking. So a 9 RPE means that you could do 1 more repetition. All right. So that would actually be 2 reps from failure, or that would be 1 RIR. 9.5 RPE means could not do more reps, but could do slightly more load. And then 10 RPE is could not do more reps or load. It's just a perfect illustration of why I don't like using RPE or RIR. And it's because it just makes it needlessly confusing. If I say 1 rep from failure, that means you got all the reps that you could in a set, but you didn't fail any reps. If I say 0 RIR, that could actually mean failing the rep, but it could also mean 1 rep from failure. Both are 0 RIR because you didn't have a rep in the tank. And then with RPE, I honestly think that RPE is most useful for power lifters and people who lift very heavy, because if you do say 4 reps on the squat, so you squatted 300, you could do 4 reps, and there is no way that you can do 5 reps. Now, if you go down, let's say to 290, maybe you can still do 4 reps and it feels a little bit easier, but there is no way you could do 5 reps still. And then at the same time, you could go from 300 to 305 and you could still grind out 4 reps and it would be even harder. And in either one of those cases, you're talking about 4 reps that you can do. It's just in one case, it feels slightly harder, slightly easier. But adding an extra rep is a huge difference. So I think in that case, this RPE scale can become useful. But I think for most of us that are lifting to get jacked, I think it's just making it needlessly confusing. Any comments on that?
I mean, I feel like it's helpful to have terminology so people know what people are referring to. I think what you said, reps from failure, is helpful and pretty easy. I guess that would be RFF, which I've never heard before anybody actually use. But obviously people just say the words. But man, I don't know. It's just one of those things where I try not to get too bogged down into it. And even the failure, because then if you say, oh, reps from failure, well, then what was failure, right? And we get back to the first question. It's one of those things where it's not pointless, because you need to have a way to define terminology, and you have to have a way to gauge intensity and progression of intensity. But at some point, I think as long as you're consistent and you are saying, okay, I'm consistently training to 0 RIR, or 9 RPE, or 1 rep from failure, I think they're all fine. I mean, I don't think anything I'm definitely down for the idea of getting into well, what's best and what helps somebody who's new to training, visualize it best and have a greater grasp of it. But do I think that the terminology used is going to actually make much of a difference? Not really. But I also understand the frustration of people who see all these things. And it's all right, can we just have something that's consistent?
Hey guys, just a brief interruption. I want to let you know that round 2 of my group coaching service has now opened up. In this coaching system, you will get a customized training and diet setup tailored for your needs, detailed guidance on training progression and diet management, and you will be able to interact with me and other members of the group, both in written format and on calls during the week. And for a limited time now, you can hop on a call with me and we can talk over your goals and see if you are a good fit for this. So if this sounds interesting to you, then check the link in the video or show description below and you can book a call with me. But if you would rather just send an email, you can also do that. Also check out the show description for that. All right, that's it. Let's continue with the show. So I think the next thing that we should talk about is essentially how big of a difference like all of this actually makes. So obviously there is like this big debate in the industry. Should you train to failure, or should you train one rep from failure, which is what I generally tend to recommend, or should you leave one rep in the tank? And I think when we address that, there's a couple of things to talk about. First of all, I just said for most of my clients, and when I'm looking at my own training, I recommend one rep from failure. So basically do an M rep in every set. Don't fail any reps. What do you typically recommend to your clients, and how do you typically like to train?
Typically, I will start with 8 reps in reserve, and then I'll gradually, at the end of a mesocycle, go up to like 5 reps in reserve. I try to not have people push too intense. So
that's good.
My standard is like you should be able to have a full conversation by the end of your set, and like even more ideally like in the middle of your set.
Right. That's good. All right, so let's move on. Next topic. Just kidding.
Yeah, honestly, man, like I push people pretty hard because like I'll start off even with myself and clients. It's like, okay, so like you reset exercises, let's say, and that's another thing we can get into as well. But basically, it's like, all right, you're just starting off. Well, I want you to have pretty ideal form. I want you to keep maybe 1 or 2 reps in reserve, and then we're going to progress. And to your point, you made a post about it, about like, if the reps or the sets just get more difficult, that's not truly progress, right? And this is why sometimes I'll have like a form reset, because I think you have to take into account that you're working with human beings, and that yes, like this one of the downsides of focusing so much on progress is that you tend to change form a little bit. And I'm totally guilty of that. So, let's say you start with 100 pounds for 10 reps and it's 2 RIR. And then the next week it's 100 pounds for 11 reps. And then it's 100 pounds for 12 reps. That's probably going to be a little bit harder, because if you're beyond beginner stages, that is going to be harder. You're not going to gain 1 rep every single week. But then as you add weight, one of the nice things about training and telling people to train pretty much all out, or like very close to failure, is you don't have to guess, well, last time was 3 RIR and this time I think I had 3 in the tank, maybe there was 2. It's kind of hard to know. Like, it's just a straightforward, like, that was as hard as I could do it, and then next week that was as hard as I could do it. And so while I certainly want them to have the form down, and I will certainly have them keep again, early on, 1 to 2 reps in reserve. Towards the end, I will say, like, no, like, push. And I've had clients where there were 2 I've had who kind of came from like the, keeping a lot of reps in reserve camp. And they would email me and they say, well, man, this week was pretty hard. Like, I don't know if I could have gotten another rep. And I'm like, good. Like, it's supposed to be hard. And then they said, so should I add weight? And I was like, you got the reps that I designated. So yes, add weight. And they added maybe 2.5 pounds. And lo and behold, they also got the reps that week. And I said, okay, next week, add 2.5 pounds. And they got the reps again. And they just weren't previously used to ever pushing that hard. And I'm not saying you should always do that, but and people are going to have different strategies. Obviously, a lot of them work. But for me, it's like, that's just a pretty guaranteed way to know where you're at. And eventually, yes, if your form starts loosening up a little bit, then I'd say, okay, time for a form reset. You could almost call that like my deload, like going back to like a reset. But I think that that's a good way to do it. And then when you reset, yeah, you probably will notice that you have to drop the weight a little bit to have that perfect form. But ideally, then you are beyond where you started with, of course.
Yeah. So I actually wanted to address this later, but since you brought it up, let's just address it now. So obviously, form being intact is something that we always have to assume, which is not a safe assumption ever. And that's actually why recently I started to request form videos as I start coaching someone. So I want to film themselves on a couple of key lifts, and often it's all good. So cool, it's looking good. We can just go from here. But oftentimes it's going to be like many videos sent, and then me giving feedback because it's just freaking ugly or gets progressively uglier as the set progresses. So if you're doing a cable fly and you're bending your elbows progressively more and more rep to rep, then basically you're faking your own progression, and it's going to be hard to actually measure your progression, because did you really progress or you just cheated more and more? And the same applies for any other exercise. So that is one thing. And then the other thing that you brought up is that is exactly the reason why I give that prescription, which is 1 rep from failure, is because that's the easiest way to measure progression and to keep track of progression. So in principle, I don't think there's any issue with someone training 3 reps from failure all the time, if they actually are consistent with that, and it's truly always 3 reps from failure. If they are progressing and they're adding load to the bar, or they're getting more reps and it's still the same 3 reps from failure, that is true progress. If someone can do that for a year and make awesome strength gains and correspondingly muscle gains, I'm 100% happy with that. But what actually tends to happen in practice is that they don't stay at 3 reps from failure. They will eventually go to 2 and then to 1. And then as a coach, I'm looking at their progress when they notify me that they're plateaued now. And then I just don't know. Like, okay, so like, when did the actual plateau begin in your performance? As in, like, when was the point where actually you didn't improve anymore, but we couldn't detect that because you were grinding closer and closer to failure? Whereas if I know that, okay, each set is basically all out, so 1 rep from failure, so M rep, then I know that, okay, if the weight is going up, if the reps are going up, that is true progress. When you're plateaued, that's a real plateau. So then we can actually like start diagnosing things. So that's why I like it. And that's kind of my main issue with some of the recommendations that are out there, other progression models that certain individuals use in the industry. There is nothing inherently wrong with starting a mesocycle with like 4 reps in reserve and gradually going up to like failure. But that just prolongs the time in which you're getting true feedback on your progress. That way, you're basically able to compare like apples to apples every 4th week. Because every 4th week is only the time when you're looking at, 1 rep from failure to 1 rep from failure. Because up until that point, you were just training closer and closer to failure. Whereas like I, as a coach, I want that constant, very direct feedback on someone's progress. And the easiest way to achieve that is to keep as many variables standard as possible, which means keeping set numbers the same, keeping proximity to failure the same, and the only thing that changes is the load on the bar and the reps. So just something to clarify, like I don't have any romantic whatever, like you have to train hard, like true growth only happens when you're pushing yourself to the limits. Like that's not why I like 1 rep from failure. It's simply because of standardization and ease of measuring progress. So just something to clarify. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
So this actually might be a relevant point from the John Meadows podcast that if you haven't check it out, Brains and Gains podcast. But so a point he made that, and again, like I like John a lot. John's a smart guy. I'm sure he knows this. I think maybe because there were a few comments both in my DMs and in the comment section about it that I think maybe it wasn't clarified properly, where he said something along the lines of, well, if you believe in progressive overload, how are you going to have progressive overload if you don't train to failure? And I think that doesn't quite. It's kind of a strongman argument in the sense that, to the same point as, well, if you always train to failure, it's the same as, it's not the same, but it's the same as like you always keep, let's say, 3 reps in reserve, right? If you are of the belief that you will still adapt to 3 reps in reserve, which I believe John does not. And that's where the big distinction is, at an advanced level. I believe he does not. So John believes, and I totally understand where he's coming from, that if you're an advanced trainee and you've been pushing yourself on these things, and then all of a sudden you're doing these sets and you still have 3 or even 4 reps in reserve, that there's no way that that's going to lead to new adaptations. And on the whole, I tend to agree with him. I mean, we can get into the number of sets and the type of exercise and the reps and all that, but just on average, I tend to agree with that. But if you believe, like a lot of the studies show, that when you do a 3 RIR set, you will still make progress, then you absolutely can avoid training to failure and have progressive overload, because the whole point, the whole idea is that you would have adapted. So, okay, again, you do 100 pounds for 10 reps, but you could have done 13. Well, next week, if you've adapted, then you could do 100 pounds for 11 reps because you could have done 14. And then the next week, 100 pounds for 12 reps because you could have done 15, etc. Now, again, in theory, that makes sense. In practice, I don't think that's ever going to happen, because it's going to be hard for you to consistently gauge that you're 3 RIR every week. I think it's going to be hard to gauge that, or not just hard to gauge, I think it's going to be unlikely that you see that. And then this is where somebody like myself would have a big problem, where I am very focused on progressive overload. And so if you told me, well, stay 3 RIR, but then I get to 3 RIR and it's the same number of reps that I got the last 2 weeks, I'm going to be pissed. I'm going to say, screw this, and I'm going to want to get that extra rep. And then that goes back into what you said, Abel, did you really progress? I would argue in that particular week, no, I did not progress, because I had to force myself to train harder to get the extra rep. But I have increased the stimulus relative to the previous week, and therefore I will likely truly progress the next week, which is basically in line with what something like Mike Israetel would say, that yes, you are maybe not getting stronger week to week, but you are increasing the stimulus. So just because you went from 4 RIR to 3 RIR to 2 RIR, no, maybe you didn't actually get that much, you didn't gain 2 reps of true strength, but you've increased the stimulus. So I understand where he's coming from in that sense, because you truly are increasing the stimulus, and that should lead to an adaptation. I think I and a lot of other people, like even like when I had the little debate, I guess, with Paul Canoe and Calvin, where he is not a fan of the cycling. I think that's a whole other topic we could get into, but it's okay, does it matter then to then reset to a 4 RIR and go up to a 0 RIR over and over, which, I don't think it makes that much of a difference. But anyway, try not to ramble too much. But yeah, that's basically my thoughts on it.
Yeah, the John Meadows podcast and that whole little segment, I think there are, as you noted, basically 3 potential reasons for which he said what he said, which is if you're trying to institute progressive overload and you want to get super strong, explain it to me how you can still stay 3 reps from failure. Like, explain that to me. I think one reason for which he might have said that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what progressive overload is, which is how we all start out, which is the belief that progressive overload means training harder and harder week to week and increasing the stimulus week to week, which it's not. Progressive overload is an outcome of adaptation to training. So you trained, you got a little bit bigger, you adapted to it neurologically, whatever, all kinds of things that go into adaptation, which means that next time around when you come back, your capacities expanded, now you're stronger. So to actually match the effort level from last week, you will have to use a higher load to still keep the set equally challenging. That's what progressive overload is. It's basically a consequence of training, not a driver of adaptation per se. The driver of adaptation is the training itself. progressive overload is a necessary outcome. So that's option one. Option two, as you noted, is that he doesn't believe that at a certain level, 3 reps in reserve is just an adequate stimulus and you just have to train closer to failure. Option number 3 is that he is just talking about the practicalities, which you and I talked about here, which is that it's just really hard to gauge what a true 3 reps in reserve is, and people will just intuitively train closer and closer to failure. So in practice, it just doesn't work out. And like you, because I like John and I respect him a lot, I will assume that it's one of the latter two and not the first one, which is a misunderstanding of what progressive overload is. So next thing that we have to address here, which is kind of what I alluded to before, just we kind of went on a different tangent, is how big of a difference does this really make from purely a making gains perspective? So is it going to make a big difference in terms of recovery, how much volume you can tolerate, how all of that interrelates with or results in the eventual muscle growth? Like how big of a deal it is if you train 2 reps from failure. So let's assume that the practical issues that we addressed are not a problem. Someone is actually able to stay at 3 reps in reserve or stay at 2 reps in reserve. They're not faking their progression by training closer and closer. So let's assume all of that is good. How big of a deal is it if you train, say, 3 reps from failure all the time versus 1 rep from failure? Just first thoughts that you have on this, and then I have a couple of points that I think we specifically need to address on that.
So just to clarify, how significant of a difference do I feel it is if long term somebody is constantly training to 3 RIR versus 1 RIR?
Yeah.
I mean,
or even failing, like even failing reps.
So I think obviously like all the guys like Dante and John and Scott would say that at an advanced level, like you need to train to failure, so it's going to make a big difference. And if you try to do all 3 RIR, it's not going to make any progress at all. I think most would agree that if you're a beginner and even intermediate, it's probably completely fine to train at 3 RIR. And again, somebody made the point in my comment section, I forget what day this was, but they were like, well, training, they said something like training 4 RIR is still extremely hard. I was like, well, I mean, that obviously is going to depend on the exercise, right? I mean, if you're doing if you're doing 5 rep curls and you have 4 reps left, obviously that's not a very hard set. But if you do a 20 rep squat and you have 4 reps left, that's still a really hard set. So obviously, I mean, that's just kind of a side point. And if you're doing the overarching point there just being that the higher the reps go, the closer overall to failure, you're still going to feel especially with the bigger exercises. So anyway, I think if you're doing, 12 plus rep sets and they have 3 RIR, I think you're going to progress just fine for a long time. I mean, especially when we look at all of the other factors that go into muscle growth, as long as there's some mechanical tension stimulus and, you have reasonable genetics, you are sleeping, eating, etc. Yeah, I think you're going to progress just fine. It's hard for me to imagine that somebody is really going to get, all the studies also, pretty much almost all of the studies seem to support 2 to 3 reps in reserve. It's just, and again, based on just really anecdote, personal experience, whatever, it's hard for me to imagine that always staying 3 RIR and never going past that is going to lead to optimal progress. And again, that's just based on my experience and talking to a lot of people. I don't know if maybe there's 1 or 2 studies that show that. One was kind of thrown out recently. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to address here from my end is kind of the arguments against training to failure or even very close to failure all the time. And that is, you hear all these things about, obviously we will have to touch on volume here a bit, but you hear all these things about how training to failure or very close to failure, fatigue goes up exponentially. And studies show that training to failure like prolongs your recovery time by 24 hours versus leaving 1 or 2 reps in the tank. I wouldn't say I call bullshit on that, but I just think that it's taken out of context a lot. So for one, it's very hard to really rely on studies that were done on this, just because what you really call failure, as we touched on it before, probably that depends on the lab that is carrying out the study. So I was actually listening to a podcast. Maybe I should even actually cut in that clip from that podcast. It was Revive Stronger interviewing Brad Schoenfeld, and Steve asked Brad what they actually mean by failure when they are doing their studies. And Brad said that, like, well, it actually depends. Like some researchers, like James Steele and Fisher, they actually have people fail reps. Like when they are literally failing the rep, and then the assistant comes and helps them out, and that's what they call failure. He said that in most of their studies, they don't quite take people to that point, because as a researcher, their primary concern is not getting their participants hurt. So when they say, okay, I don't think I have another rep, they will have them stop the set there. So that is one consideration. The second consideration is, for example, I posted some videos on Instagram where I'm actually failing a rep on the chest press. Now, how that looks like is I think I will have that 10th rep, let's say, and I attempt that 10th rep for like half a second. And then half a second in, I'm realizing, no, I don't have that. So I just quit the set there. So that was training to failure. On the other hand, if you're tuning into like Scott Stevenson or, one of these like death zone training to failure until your eyes are bleeding type guys, and you will see them like grinding against a bar that is not moving and like inroading, as the HIT community likes to call it. So basically doing a 10-second isometric, let's say on a leg press. Like you don't have the rep, but you're still pushing. Yeah, I could see that being a serious detriment to your recovery. I could see that seriously prolonging recovery time afterwards, because whatever, muscle fibers are just exponentially fatigued, metabolic stress rises to an exponentially high level. So there's a difference between that and between me just realizing like, no, I don't have this rep. Both are failure, but again, exactly like how far into that are you pushing? And again, like you said, what is the exercise? Like realizing that, okay, like this lateral raise is just not really the same lateral raise anymore. Like I would have to use some serious body English here. So I just stopped the rep midway through. So technically I failed the rep versus failing on a leg press. Like this is very, very different. So I just think we shouldn't get too overzealous with these concerns about, oh my God, like if you train to failure, like it's seriously going to limit the amount of volume you can do. Like I really don't think that me aborting that set that I failed on the chest press 1 rep before that, I don't think it would make a serious difference in how I will be able to train my chest 2 days later. So yeah, any thoughts on that, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's like crazy grinders are a lot more prone to injury. And like, I mean, again, like you said before, that kind of goes into, well, what is truly failure? Do you have to try for 2 seconds? I mean, is it really so different to say, well, I really struggle on that last rep. It's so obvious I'm not going to get it, so I don't even attempt it, versus, okay, I still attempt it, and within half a second, I realize it's not happening, so I just stop. I would say those two are more similar, even though one could argue one was not failure and one was failure, compared to two that are both failure, but one is the quick stop and the other one is, well, I tried and I tried and I tried, and it was like a literally like 7-second grind and I still failed it. That one is going to burn you out way more, and they're both quote unquote failures. So again, it's just why the conversation gets a little more muddied.
Yeah, and actually that just reminds me of something that I maybe should have addressed earlier, is that just as much as there is a difference between failure and failure, depending on what exercise you're talking about, there can also be a difference between 1 rep to failure and 1 rep to failure. So, for example, like you will just have different capacities on different days. So sometimes that last rep you can get is still a relatively smooth, slower, but like very doable rep. But you can definitely tell that the next one you just wouldn't get, so you don't even attempt it. At the same time, sometimes that last rep that you can still get in a set is like a grinder from hell. Like it takes like 5 seconds to complete it. So both are 1 rep to failure. So I will actually tell my clients that, like, look, you can auto-regulate this a little bit. So on a squat or a leg press, for example, if you feel like, man, maybe I can get that last rep, but it's going to be like the worst grinder of my life, and I can tell that, like, we might as well call that failure, because like that's going to wreck me for the rest of the session. Stop there. Technically, that was 2 reps from failure, but we all know what happened here. At the same time, sometimes like you still get that rep. It was hard, but it was not like a terrible grinder. But you can tell, like, okay, if I attempt that next rep, I would definitely fail that somewhere around the sticking point. So that's just another thing to clarify there. But yeah, like basically the conclusion there is, like on many exercises, like most upper body movements, I think fall into this category. I just don't think that there is like a massive difference in how fatiguing a lift is if you stop 2 reps from failure or 1 rep to failure, or even fail and you don't do like force reps, or like you keep pushing even though you know that you're failing the rep already. So that's just something to address there. And then I guess one obvious thing that we cannot bypass here is just the whole concept of, you know, should you leave more reps in the tank so that you can do more volume? So, you know, if you leave 3 reps in the tank, then maybe, and you do that all the time, then maybe you can recover from, 18 sets a week. Maybe if you train 1 rep from failure, you can only recover from 15 sets a week. And since studies show that, those 2 intensities or intensity of efforts are roughly equivalent in terms of outcome, more sets should lead to more hypertrophy. So this one is something that we could probably do an entire podcast on, so we will try to be concise. But what are your first thoughts on this?
So the idea of keeping more reps in reserve in order to attain higher volumes?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, again, I totally understand the principle of it. I don't know, man. It's been really interesting to see so much of like the volume craze, and I just don't like. I'm glad to see that I'm not just like going crazy here and everybody else is on board with it, because for a while it seemed like everybody was going towards the higher volume, and now just a couple years later, even like Scott Stevenson, who has higher volume routines, or John Meadows, who has higher volume routines, we were talking about like, okay, how many of these sets are like truly to failure, and it's not like a ridiculous amount. I think, like what's his name, Jeff Alberts. Jeff Alberts is a good example of somebody who is a fan of low volume. Paul Canoe, myself. Just inherently, I have that bias towards lower volume. I've done enough high volume stuff. Like plenty of people are like, oh, but have you tried this or that? It's like, I have, and I've had a lot of higher volume routines, and I just didn't see like this massive benefit. Now I can't ignore the studies, right? I mean, there's a lot of scientific evidence to show that, hey, higher volume leads to faster progress. Now, at this point, being, 15 plus years into it, it's hard for me to make any conclusions about what I do now, right? Because if I'm maxed out and it just took longer because I did lower volume, well, then how would I know? But I also, along the way, had done higher volume routines, and I can't, it's hard because it's not like this vacuum of like, okay, I had 2 years of low volume, and it was all low volume, and then it was 2 years of high volume, and how did I gauge the progress? And even then, it wouldn't be a fair comparison, because over time, the gains are going to slow down. So even if that, in that little thought experiment, the rate of gain stayed the same, you could argue that high volume was better because I was able to maintain the same rate even though I was more advanced. But anyway, so I just think that it's very hard, other than some of these semi-controlled studies, to test those out. And even to my knowledge, we don't have a study comparing all out failure for 1 or 2 sets versus reps in reserve for like 3 or 4. We have some comparing the same sets for different levels of intensity, and the same levels of intensity with more volume. But as far as I'm aware, we don't have that specific study. So in general, I'm not a huge fan of saying, well, I'm specifically, like, I'm okay with manipulating volume, but I don't specifically say, let's try to like keep a lot in reserve so that we can add more volume. And I think that's going to lead to more growth. Maybe you could argue acutely that's going to have a short-term benefit, but it's just not something I really get into with my clients.
Yeah. So first of all, like, just disclaimer, like, we won't be able to give like 100% perfect answer to this. So I don't think either of us completely know, and not just the two of us, I don't think anybody really knows, like, okay, exactly how is the math working out here. So if I leave this many reps in the tank, then my recovery will be this much less prolonged, which will mean that I can tolerate this much more sets, and this much more sets is going to contribute to this much more growth. Or if I leave less reps in the tank, then each set is going to be maybe that much more stimulative, but that's going to reduce the amount of sets that I can tolerate per week by that much. That's going to reduce growth overall that much. So like, nobody has that perfectly mathed out. So we will have to speculate here a little bit. But I think this is where the whole effective reps concept can come in somewhat handy, which I know Greg Nuckols debunked it pretty well. Not debunked it so much, but basically pointed out how you cannot just look at it as simplistically as, okay, the last 5 reps of a set is what's most effective. Therefore, you can just say, okay, I can do 5 heavy singles, and that's going to be the same growth stimulus as doing a heavy set of 10, where the last 5 reps were very hard. So it doesn't work out like that. So it's not a perfect model. However, I think we can sort of all agree that, like, let's say that from 5 reps from failure onwards, the set starts becoming effective. And that's where the whole, like, studies show that, 4 RIR is already as effective as 1 RIR, like all of that stuff. That's where all of that comes into play. However, I think we can all agree that if you have, let's say, a 10 rep max, and you do, say, 4 reps, so you leave 6 reps in the tank, like, those 4 reps are probably not going to be doing too much for you. If you just kept doing that, and even if you did like 100 sets per week, I don't think many people would expect to grow a lot from that. If you do at least 6 reps, then okay, now you're start eliciting some growth. But I think intuitively all of us can tell that, okay, if with that 10 rep max you do 8 reps, that should like still be somewhat more effective than if you only do 6 reps. Like, I just feel like that's a pretty intuitive thing. And I don't think any of the experts, even those that are debunking the effective reps model, would disagree with that. And that's why everybody, like including Mike Israetel, when he's talking shit about training to failure, like he would never recommend, always doing only 6 reps with your 10 rep max. Now, is there like kind of a tipping point where the diminishing returns are like kicking in really fast and the extra stimulus you're getting per set is not that much more, but the burden on your recovery is becoming much more? So like that's where you should cut it off. Perhaps that is, and where exactly that is, it's hard to tell. I would be inclined that probably it is roughly at that, 2 reps from failure mark. Like probably that's like a very good sweet spot. And then I say train 1 rep from failure for those practical reasons that we discussed. But I think that's where the whole effective reps model becomes like a pretty useful tool, because I think we can all kind of agree that, okay, like you reach that point in the set where it starts becoming effective, which is, let's say, like 4 reps from failure. Like there should still be a difference between that and only 1 or 2 reps shy of failure. So I think that kind of can give you an idea of how crazy you should go with the whole thing of like, I'm going to leave more reps in the tank so that I can do more sets. yeah, it's fine to do that. Just don't go crazy with that. Like don't go crazy with the idea of leaving more and more reps in the tank so that you can maximize the number of sets you can do per week, because then you will grow more. Like, train reasonably hard. I'm fine with you stopping 2 reps from failure. You don't have to train with the recommendations that I'm giving to my clients, but probably there is that sweet spot somewhere in between. So I think if you're training at least 2 reps from failure, maybe you can just make the subjective call that I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to train even harder than that, because maybe I can then tolerate more volume. So basically, that's my very rambly response to that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that.
So yeah, man, we just awkwardly arrived to an abrupt end because we realized that we pretty much addressed all of the points. So Dave, any kind of summarizing thoughts that you have, or like some practical message that you want to leave people here with?
Yeah, I mean, I wish, like, as far as the practicality of it, it's one of those things where, like, if you're subscribed to mass research reviews and like you're just like a podcast junkie, yeah, you'll probably enjoy it. If you are just somebody who's looking for like really practical information, I would just summarize it as, I personally believe that you should be training within 0 to 2 reps, like, to failure, or, you know, reps in reserve. And I really feel like it doesn't have to be that complicated. I honestly think that as long as you are training with sufficient intensity, again, I would call that, you know, 0 to 2 RIR, that other factors are going to play a role here. Obviously, a lot of people know that, you know, genetics, how you're actually like setting up your training, nutrition, sleep, etc. I wouldn't stress too much about, man, was that a 1 or 2 RIR? Just focus on progressing over time, and I think you'll be fine. But not to discount everything we've said there, I think it is important to have proper terminology so people can have these type of discussions and make progress as far as like the field as a whole, so we know what we're discussing when we say RIR, RPE, training to failure, all of that.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to come in here and says like, I found that this works best for me, it works best for me to start easier in my mesocycle and start out with like 4 reps in reserve and gradually work up to like 1 rep from failure and this and that works well for me. Like, look, I don't give a shit how you train. Like, honestly, I want you to make great gains and I want you to progress. If it's working for you, like, you don't have to prove yourself to me or to Dave or whatever. If it works, then it works. Like, honestly, it's not a competition, or we are not here to just mentally masturbate. We are just trying to give you guys some practical insights and some practical guidance. So as far as I'm concerned, as far as what I'm recommending, what I'm doing for myself, and just what I found to be the most easily trackable, easily standardizable method for training, and that honestly just seems to work really well, I can summarize this entire podcast in 7 words. Train 1 or 2 reps away from failure. Maybe with that away in there, it was 8 words. But basically that's my conclusion. So yeah, folks, that was pretty much our podcast for today. Dave, it was great to have a conversation again, which was a bit more kind of free-flowing. We will do some Q&As in the upcoming period as well. But it was good to do one of these types of podcasts again. So thanks for coming on. And then just let us know where we can find you, your work, and all of that stuff.
Yeah, so podcast is Brains and Gains Podcast on YouTube and pretty much all podcast apps. Instagram is Dave_Maconi. And right now my website's temporarily down. But if you want to reach me for the coaching or whatever, it's just maconid91@gmail.com. I'd probably just go to the Instagram though, because from there you can DM me, or on there's a link to directly email me.
Awesome. By the way, I added up the words in the meantime, and I realized it was 8 words and not 7. So I apologize. All right, folks, that's it for today. See you next time.